Hi there, it's Wade from Bots vs Cons here. In this video, I'm going to be going through my process, pretty much start to finish, on how I create my Transformers wallpapers. Something I've been wanting to do for a while, even just for a bit of fun. I don't know if anyone's actually particularly interested, but I thought I'd go through this process on screen so that way you could follow through and just see exactly how I do what I do, find out some of the weird little things that I actually do in Photoshop and when I take my photos to make it happen. That way you can get some cool images, basically like the ones you see on the screen here. But basically, what I do is I set up an area somewhere in my house and I grab the whatever figure it is I'm going to be playing with or taking photos of. I set it up and I also grab a few lights I have for basically some lights I use for other filming, so I can play with some cool lighting effects. And sometimes I don't always do this, but it's something I do for a lot of my images these days. But I basically set that up somewhere, pose it, take a few snaps, and I pop my camera on my tripod and go from there. But one thing I want to note here is that when I'm actually taking these photos, I am using a really slow shutter speed, because something that happens is when you just take snaps up close of Transformers, at least with this camera, and I don't have a super expensive camera, but it is a DSLR. Sometimes the edges are a little noisy and just not very smooth. So what I basically do is I get a tripod and I set the timer and actually hit the camera button so that way it'll count for 2 or 3 seconds, and the actual force of me hitting the button doesn't shake the camera and cause any weird motion blur. So I basically set everything up, take a whole bunch of photos, and then review. Go through and see what photos I've actually come up with. Go through, pick out one, maybe even a few. Sometimes I'll actually hold on to a few and do some images there. But for this one, I'm going to stick with this particular shot of Optimus Prime, and I feel like it's kind of like a nice little play on a other image I did a while ago about Siege Megatron in battle. I'm going to try and do basically the Optimus Prime version of that. So I'm going to jump onto the computer and I'll show you basically how it's all done.
Okay, so I'm in Photoshop and I have the picture open, and basically I'm going to start working. And you're probably going to know straight away, which you wouldn't have noticed before, is that just below a certain part of the picture here, his leg's actually sitting on this funny angle because of the way I had him. Now, I'm actually going to just sort of like chop that out and try to disguise it with some of the elements I have. So basically, I've got this here. The first thing I pretty much have to do to start this is I have to cut him out. Now, this isn't necessarily a tutorial, but more of a look at how I do things. If you want, I do have a channel I can recommend to you, which will actually do slowly release Photoshop tutorials in. I'll link to that below, but basically we're just going to steamroll ahead. I'm basically just grabbing the pen tool along here somewhere. I'm going to start tracing this guy and even cutting off some of what I don't want. So I'm just going to get started on that, and we might just speed ahead and see how we go from there. And you can see there, basically we've got him cut out and we're ready to basically add a background and go from there. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is actually add in a background. And now what I've done is I've gone, just to save a bit of time in this video, I have gone ahead of time and found some images I'm going to use for this. But just in case you're wondering where I get a lot of these free images, I use Pexels, that's P-E-X-E-L-S, and unsplash.com for a lot of pretty cool imagery. Just because it's free, the quality's great, there's no sort of attribution required necessarily, but head there if you want some free images, or otherwise I'll take them myself or purchase them at a stock photo site. So I do have an image I'm going to drag in now, which is this one here. I'm going to pop this in the background. I thought this kind of suited, it's very visually outstanding sort of looking picture. I'm not going to really focus much on having that island on there, but I do want to just have something in the background that's just going to give it a bit of a cool look. A lot of it's probably going to be fairly drowned out. It looks pretty horrible there to begin with, but in time we will improve it. It's more there for reference at the moment so I can see how it's going to look. What I'm going to do is I'm going to rasterize that layer and I'm going to play with the curves. So go image adjustments, curves. I'm going to darken it up a little bit. So now what I'm going to do is basically I'm going to start playing around with the look of Optimus himself. So I try to get that toy look a little bit out and get more of the actual, like, mechanical robot sort of look to him. So I do have a few things I do that are a little bit, could be considered a little bit different than what most people would do. But one thing I do try and do is I try to basically go through and really accentuate a lot of the lines, because with plastic here, because it's all molded in this one piece, there's not really any great defining lines on here. So I actually quite often I'll select the image. I'll actually even create a group so I can mask that. And then I just start drawing where I think some detail would be good to go. So I'm going to do, make this nice and small. So here, like where it joins up, I'll actually start drawing in there. Although the opacity should be a bit higher. And you can see if you get it, it looks pretty ordinary to begin with, but when you give it a bit of time, it can get some nice sort of results out of it. It almost acts as a bit of shadow as well. I don't want to spend too long doing this necessarily. But yeah, I'll just go around and do this in different little areas, or where I think a bit of shadow can sort of fit. And you'll see when I get to it, you'll notice that I don't leave it just perfectly crisp like this, because it wouldn't look, it just doesn't look very good to do it that way. We do want to get it looking a little more subtle and not quite as stark. But when we get there, you'll see it. Okay, I'll only do a few. That'll pretty much cover it there for now. So what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to go to filter, blur these lines a little bit, not quite that much, enough so that they still have a bit of an effect. And I'm going to do color burn and just knock the fill back a bit so that we just get a more of a subtle look. So that way it just kind of like pops out some of the edges a little bit. If I turn it off, you can see it just creates a little bit of sort of depth in there. And another thing I do is I then go through, and one thing that I discovered this by accident once, but I discovered that if I sort of do this, I create a bit of shadow around all the panels, around the edging of the panels, and it gives it a bit more of a metallic look. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another layer here, and let's call it, panel shadow or something like that. And this time, I'm going to get the brush, hardness down, and size up. Not quite that big. And I'm going to just go through and do this effect very quickly. Now, this is one of the ones that definitely, when people see it, they sort of think, what the hell are you doing? But it does get some pretty cool results. So I can make my brush a bit smaller. It's another one where you can get nice and rough with it, because you just sort of blur it out, and the effect you get from it's actually still pretty cool. So these ones, even though they're lit, I will do it here. Luckily, this is, because of the lighting that we did with this, it already has a pretty good look to it, but we're still going to do our best to improve it. When it comes to the helmet, I do tend to put a bit more time, a smaller brush, trying to get those details a little more noticeable. All right, so what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to put this onto luminosity saturation first. So see how it sort of takes the color out of the panel. And I'm going to knock it back a little bit till I get about here. I'm going to copy this layer. I'm going to blur it a little bit. And I'm going to get the old color burn out again. This time not quite as harsh. I'm going to knock it right down. Bring it in a bit. And we do get, if you don't overdo it, if you can find that nice balance with the two, you can get a bit more of a dirtier sort of look. So once again, if I move all the effects we've done so far, you can see how we've sort of given him a bit more of a dirtier look. But it's starting to get a bit dark now, so what we actually need to do is generate a bit of light. So now I actually do the opposite, where I get a really fine white and I highlight a lot of edges. And I don't, that way everything just sort of has a bit more of a pop to it. Now, as a graphic designer, I usually hate when people say, you know, has a bit of pop to it, but that's pretty much the best thing I can think to describe it at the moment. So you get these highlights. On the helmet is definitely a good place because it really brings that to life a bit. What I'm going to do before I go any further, I'm going to pop that on the color dodge so we can see how it's going to look. So you can see already, we're already starting to look a bit sharper. Come up here, there. And you see here, if I turn that off, you can see how much it sort of brings the helmet to life. It does bring it to life a little too much though. So what I do is I do also grab an eraser, something fairly large, so I can just sort of taper it off in some areas. Maybe along here. Now in some areas I do tend to actually get a bit bigger. When we've got like a really like a lit flat panel, I'll actually color the whole thing in and then go through and just knock it back a little bit. So there we've got a bit of a shadow, get the opacity down a bit and just knock it back just a smidgen so we get that nice bright panel look. So as you can see, Optimus is starting to look pretty sharp. So now, next thing I'm going to do is I'm happy with the highlights, generally speaking. Another thing I do also do, just to get a little more realism out of these, once again, I will just quickly show you the difference between what we've done and the straight photo. You can see the straight photo looks alright, but this just adds a little more sort of character to it. What I'm actually going to do now is actually find some spots I want to make pretty much a I'm going to take all the color out of them. So I'm going to copy this base layer, pop it into our section there. I'm going to make it black and white, and I'm going to also get my levels. I'm going to just get the contrast not too high because of the way the photo is, and then what I'm going to do is create a mask and invert it all together. So what I can do from here is I can paint in areas that I want to be pretty much purely grayscale, because if it was actually, you know, like an actual robot or mech sort of thing, like, you know, not the Transformers are mechs, but you sort of get the idea. It sort of can take some of the color out and give it that appearance that there are working parts in there that aren't painted, and yeah, give it a pretty cool look. You can play with how the layer sits. I can also just knock the opacity back a bit. I just like getting nice bits and pieces. Now it all seems just a little bit light for my liking, so I'm going to adjust this with curves. Make the whole thing darker. Oh wait, I'm going to select the actual image first, haven't I? All good. So I want to darken it up a little bit. Now I can go back and unpaint some areas if I don't think they've turned out as well as I'd liked. And I can then do it again with a less opacity. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is, because he's firing into the distance, I'm going to have a bit of a yellow sort of kickback on him. Actually, what I am going to do, I'm going to add a bit more of that color just throughout here. But this time I'm actually going to knock it back a little bit, just so we got like a bit of like a used effect through there. All right. Actually, before I go any further on the color, I am going to go in and add a new folder. I'm going to call it Eyes.
And I create a new layer, and what I basically do is I select around the eyes, which are very thin at the moment, but I select around the eyes, pick a nice blue color, I think is reasonably accurate, and I paint that blue in. Now I can try different blends, such as linear dodge. Maybe I knock it down a little bit, maybe I blur it a little so that the edges aren't quite so sharp. And then I'll actually create another layer on top, grab some white, and sort of create like light pupils, if that makes sense. And then I'll put that again onto color dodge, which is just gives it a bit of a cool effect. You see we actually have eyes in there now. But what I really like to do is look at how the light of the eyes would affect everything around them. So I actually go ahead and create another layer where I pick that blue again. I pick that blue, nice and big, and I create this glow here. So go linear dodge for this one, I think. Just create a bit of a glow there. Maybe color dodge would be better. It doesn't actually, it has to work a bit harder for the glow, which I think has a better look. And then I go through again another layer, and I actually draw in where I think the light would reflect. So I draw this in here. I do it very rough. Draw it on the nose here, there. I can even get a little bit of white if I want to, and just add a little bit of white in there just to get it to show up. I'll go back to my blue color, and I'll add it in the panels here. And then I'll get my eraser and just kick that back a little bit. Filter, blur. I do spend a little bit of time doing this part of it just because I really like it to look as authentic as possible. It doesn't have to be full on, just has to kind of be there. Now next part is to do the same, pretty much the same thing again, but a much softer version of it. So I actually go through and just create, create larger bits of blue. I'll create it, I'll find a panel down here and pop it down there. Maybe I keep on hitting my Windows key. Maybe a little bit hits this panel here. So I'm trying to think, where would that blue show up? Got piping here. Maybe even a tiny bit of kickback over there. It's a pretty strong light, I guess, but not that strong. But it's always good to just to draw it in and just erase it back a little bit. So now I've got that, I'm going to try and dial it back a little bit. So maybe I'll just thin that a bit, thin that a little bit more. Make this brush a little bit bigger. Just make it very subtle around there. I'm going to try and get a nice edge on here. Now, one other thing I want to do is that blue would not be highlighting that part of the panel there. So I'm going to dial this back a bit. Try and just remove the part of the light that's showing up in there. Pump my opacity back up a bit. And then also create a bit of a shadow where the head would be stopping the light from reaching around there. So let's just say something like that. Once again, I do give it a bit of a blur because the light wouldn't be perfectly sharp necessarily. Get my color dodge again, dial it down. And now we're getting a nice light from the eyes. So now you can see it's really starting to come to life still. If I turn this off, you can see just how much of a difference our alterations have made. He's actually starting to look like Optimus Prime is a bit alive now. So now we're going to get into some of the fun parts, which is the effects. So Optimus is shooting here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to add another folder here
I'm going to just call it the effects. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create kind of like a an orange brush. And I'm going to make this nice and big orange. And I'll go with some yellow. Dial it down a little bit. Once again, it's not going to be 100% perfect, but you sort of get the idea. Get some white in the center there. Filter, blur, Gaussian blur. Because the photo really does a lot of the hard work on this, you're really just sort of adding rough colors and bits and pieces. Now play around with the effects to see what looks good. Go through the layer blends. The overlay is not too bad, but maybe we'll stick with the linear dodge for now. And it's a little bit off point, but we'll just sort of move that across. Now I've got a few images I found online here which might do a pretty cool job of adding to this. So what I'm going to do, I've got this little sort of like fireworks effect here I want to play with. I'm going to rasterize that. Make sure the black is 100% black. So I'll go levels, add in a bit, and just use it as a cool little kind of like effect on where it's all coming out. So maybe I'll dial down this a little bit. So you've got Optimus firing his gun here. Not quite happy with the way that looks, so I might actually try switching that to a color dodge and just knocking it down a bit. And I'll add just a full white in there. This can go to being a linear dodge. Oops. Just grab a beam of white there, similar to what we did with Megatron. So he's firing off. Okay, so what he's doing now, obviously he's going to be hitting his target. So we're going to have sort of like a little bit of kickback coming back from that. I did also actually, keep this one set aside. So I'll pop that one on screen. Pop in there, it's just a sparkler. Might look a little funny, but for what we're doing here, I think it sort of has a pretty cool sort of effect. So I'm going to add in some sparks, bits and pieces. First of all, I've got this this one here, which is just like a photo of someone on a fire. Because of the direction that we're shooting, I'm going to have the sparks sort of fire out this way. So I'll pop that on screen. And you can see that edge there. What I need to do is actually, right, it's been rasterized. I need to actually make that black, 100% black. So I do that. Now they're a bit in your face, those sparks. So cancel out for a second. Go to filter, other, and minimum. I'm going to shrink them just a bit. And then of course what we can do is bring up our masking tool and remove some of them. Just paint around, keep some in front as they do add a bit of dimension and scale. Go from there. Now, one thing I didn't mention too, which I don't really intend on doing on this one, is one thing I do sometimes is add in like a dirty layer over the top. It might be like a photo of concrete or something, just to make them look a bit dirty and like battle used. So actually, no, I will backtrack and I'll add that in there. Go back into here. I'll bring up where I have some concrete. So I'll get this little concrete image here, popping it into this group. So you see how it's overlaid there. All I do, I can overlay it, multiply. I'll get overlay, knock it right down. Not quite to 1%, but you see things are starting to look a bit dirty here. So I get my mask out and I turn it off where it looks a bit too much. So these panels here, it's a little bit much, especially in the face, but not the entire face. Keep some there. So keeping that dirty sort of appearance does work all right. Another thing too is one thing I didn't do earlier is actually use that grayscale version. I did want to paint out the between the fingers. I wanted those moving parts to look like they weren't blue. This panel here as well. Now I'm also going to go back. Now I'm going to actually add in a bit of smoke into the scene, which it can be a bit difficult, but we're going to give it a crack. So I've got another layer here. It's actually even got a few sparks on it. I'm going to put that there. Don't need to have it in that group. That's why it's masked. So I will pop it in the effects group. You see we have got a hand here. What I'm going to do is basically I'm going to rasterize this layer. I'm going to get my stamp tool and I'm just going to stamp that hand out so it doesn't show up. Doesn't have to be perfect, just has to kind of be done. All right. So I can actually use screen here. And I've got that bit of smoke there. I keep on hitting Windows for some reason. That's all right. So I'll play with this. I've still got some sparks being shot out from there. We're getting a pretty cool effect now. We do want a bit of smoke around him, just like that Megatron photo. So I've got this photo of a guy who's holding up some smoke. I'm going to move, basically make him about, mirror, go that way. Oops. Just cheat a little bit. I'm going to try and get that smoke popping up around here somewhere. Unfortunately, the resolution is a bit crummy, so I'm going to have to ditch that photo. So I will grab, I've got something else here. Let's grab this smoke here. Now it's pink, but we're not going to keep it that way. So I'm going to do, rasterize this layer. Try and make that background that. Suck all the color out of it. We'll go maybe screen, but we won't have it quite as full on as that. We'll knock it back, switch it around a bit. It is a little crummy still, but we're going to make it a bit darker. So maybe if we do this, and we can add a bit of color to it, so we might add that bit of go colorize with our hue and saturation. Get that warm sort of color there. Add that in, maybe pop a little bit behind it. So we're going to go. Now keep in mind, I do wing this a lot of the time, so a lot of it's not necessarily going to be fantastic, but it's sort of going to get the job done. So now we are clouding things a bit there now. Another thing we can do is actually have these brushes, these cloud brushes that I actually got from somewhere, and I can use these, crank up the size, and create some basic clouds around. Now another thing I can also do is with this cloud pattern here, I can grab it, Shuffle it all the way down to the bottom. Pop it in behind Optimus. And I can rotate it a little bit more, maybe enlarge it. Create a little bit more, so it's a little bit more sort of trapped within it. So one thing, it is starting to look a bit funny at the moment in the sense that there's a lot of cloud and a lot of darkness. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually add a layer here. I'm going to draw in some black. I'm going to grab another larger cloud brush, draw in a heap of black here. Just try and give it a bit of depth. Also go just with a standard brush. Not so much near the top. But we are going to use that. Dial that down a little bit. I think this is a little bit stronger in the top too, so I'm going to mask out some of the top just so it shows that kind of like more of a dust settling type look. Maybe just let it fade in a little bit. So we got Optimus Prime in battle. It's not looking too bad so far. Still not great, but definitely some of the final touches will make it look a bit better too. So we'll come in here, add a bit more shadow around just to give it that real deep sort of look. All right, so let's say we're gonna stick with that for now. Now this, like I said, the colors on this isn't fantastic, but what I usually do when I get to this point is I'll actually create an adjustment layer. I'll colorize and I'll pick a color. So it might be this sort of tinge here. And as a way of marrying it all together, I'll actually hit overlay and just sort of dial it back a bit. So you can see it kind of makes the color blend a little bit more. It's not 100% perfect, but I can also duplicate it, put on normal. On normal, I should say. So overlay, that's normal. See, we get a bit more of a wartime sort of look to it. Tends to blend in a bit more. So he's starting to look like he's supposed to be in that shot. So now, the next part, which we're going to do, is basically frame it up with a little bit of shadowing around the whole thing. So basically, I'm going to get my gradients. I'm going to pick something straightforward like this. I'm just going to basically create some edging like that. Then I'll duplicate this layer, move it across. And I'm not going to keep all of this here. We'll spin that around, size it down, go out. I'll merge all these together. I'll dial it right back, have it a bit more subtle. I'll add it again, do a bit of a color burn to it just so it further frames it. If I crank that right up, you can see how tight it is. So we don't want it necessarily to be super tight, but one thing we can do is move it below the hue and saturation so it's not so in your face. And we can group these, oops, and then create a mask. If I want to keep this area nice and light, I will go through and I'll remove it from around there and around from Optimus's head in this area of focus. So we've got this light section on the left and it's sort of darkening over towards over here. And then of course, if we want to take it even further, we can continue to darken this area a bit. Probably not necessary, but it is an option. I always like to experiment. If I don't like it, I can always cut it back. And there we go. So that's pretty much how you can create that. Another way you can make it even more cinematic is actually to select the whole picture, create a new layer, go to Q, paste it in place. I'm going to invert my selection. This is probably making no sense to anyone, but what I want to do is actually isolate the darker areas of this picture, so about there. And I'm going to just get the color blue, maybe slightly green. And paint bucket that in there. So what I'm going to do is actually going to make that color. So we get this cool cinematic effect. We've got a bit of blue in the shadow. And if we were facing a bit of light, I would add a reflection in here. But for this image, I don't think it's necessary. But that's pretty much our image. That's our Optimus Prime in battle image. Once again, it's not perfect. Once you look around, you'll see there's a bit of an imperfection here with this little edge. So sometimes you do get some errors. You have to kind of go digging and figure out what that is, which I pretty much am going to now. So it's pretty much this layer here. So I'm just going to... Now, quite often when I'm doing these videos, because it's usually a speed video, sometimes I'll finish it off with these mistakes in them and then try and fix them later. But good news is we're taking our time with this one. Now we have the Optimus equivalent of Siege Megatron in battle. So hope you guys enjoyed that video and found it somewhat interesting. I will be releasing this on the website for download, so if you want to download this wallpaper, it will be up. It should be up. There'll be a link in the description below. But otherwise, thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you again later. Okay, see ya.